Welcome back to the Contemplative Science Podcast. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm joined by co-host Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, man?
I'm excited. Thanks for asking. And I do say this sort of every week that I'm excited, and I kind of mean it every week that I'm excited. I'm kind of pathologically optimistic. But this week I am actually very excited. When we were just doing our sort of pre-show rundown through the questions, I can't help but think like this is exactly the topic I'm interested in. I mean, if you go down the points that we want to hit today, they are exactly the things that I'm interested in. So I think this week's conversation could be great.
Well, yeah, so today's guest is Dr. Terje Sparby. Terje is a philosopher and meditation researcher. His main areas of research are consciousness and phenomenological or introspective methods. He's here today to talk about, amongst other things, landmarks in meditation, difficult meditation experiences, and the relationship between community and spirituality. It is a huge pleasure to have him on. Terje, thanks for being here.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
So let's kick off with something I've been thinking a lot about since having done the research, which is you've looked at what we're calling universal structures and so-called contemplative landmarks that unfold during meditation practice. What are those? What are the landmarks? Why are there landmarks?
Well, this is a big topic, and I think we might need to start sort of on a basic level whether there are landmarks like that at all. That's in itself is a big question.
Yeah.
And I think that was at least it's been my impression that this isn't really sort of the trendy topic. It hasn't been within religious studies. It's in a way been off limits. Sort of there's been some consensus around, so these are cultural constructions that can't be compared. And then some authors have sort of challenged that view and started to look into it and see, like, if you just look at, for instance, meditation handbooks, it seems like even the descriptions are similar, like comparable analogies, for instance. So that's kind of where I start. So that's been, let's say, a setup for this kind of research. You need to argue that landmarks are possible, like we can think about them. It's a valid scientific endeavor. And there has been like important developments within neuroscience that has made it easier to show that, well, there seems to be something similar going on in human physiology. So we have some more reasons to believe that maybe than we did before. So that's kind of the starting point for this. But again, sort of, I think it needs to be emphasized. This is still kind of a discussion that needs to be had, and there are difficulties when it comes to getting clear about what landmarks are. But fundamentally, you could also call it milestones. So big fundamental changes, maybe to the mind, to consciousness, that tend to happen over time, comparable, across traditions. And the map I've been using, like, there are many maps in different traditions, and they can be quite complex. Maybe you need to know the languages, even ancient languages that aren't easily accessible, that perhaps don't use the kind of analogies that we're used to, for instance. But so I rely on some work that's been done within religious studies, primarily by Kenneth Rose, which has looked into three classics of, in a sense, meditation manuals. So I think he kind of nails it when it comes to concentration practices. And there we have 5 levels, which is, first level would be what people typically experience when they meditate and notice that the mind tends to wander. You can't focus on the object. And then, like, after who knows how much time, something happens to the mind. So there's a switch where you're drawn into the object, you focus on it, you lock onto the object, and you stay there even effortlessly. Big change. And then third level is where you have initial access to altered states of consciousness, sometimes called jhanas, like deep states of concentration, often characterized by happiness, strong happiness, rapture, bliss, maybe no thoughts, equanimity, like sort of the contemplative ideals that start to unfold within the mind. And then there's a phase or a stage, landmark number 4, where there's quietude, meditation of stillness, nothing, things to solve, and the mind then finally is somehow transcended, where you get, for instance, Christian descriptions of unification with the mind of God, or with God, the being of God. Traditional Buddhist terms, nirvana, immortality, even, the big things at the end of the path, end of suffering. So that's an overview, like a 5-stage broad map of the territory. And yeah, if I can just like finish that, that's kind of where my own more phenomenologically oriented research comes in. I don't think there's much to do on sort of the first stage. Yeah, you can study mind wandering, but we kind of know quite a lot about that. But my interest starts towards sort of these new, maybe even radically new things that can happen to consciousness. That's where my interest kicks in. Is it possible? I'm a long-time meditator, and I've enjoyed all the benefits when it comes to stress reduction and things like that. But I've also always had sort of this interest also in the spiritual background to all of these kinds of practices. And then, as a practitioner, there comes the question: what is possible here? Is anything of the things that are described in these manuals true? Can it be experienced? Is it accessible to somebody who doesn't devote their life 110% to like spiritual practice? And it turns out, yeah, there are some openings you can have there, and that's where I've started there. That's kind of where my research is at the moment, having looked at the second stage, connected to effortlessness. What is that? Some deep things happen to human will, effortlessness. You're doing something, but you're not being effortful. There's also like philosophical issues there are important. So that's kind of where I'm at now, and then I'm starting to move into the third state, looking into altered state of consciousness, samadhi, jhana, and things like that. Yeah.
Wow.
So
It's so fascinating. So just to be clear, when you say you're doing research on these things, do you mean that you're going back to these maps and texts, like you're specifically looking for sort of Christian foundational texts, like maybe the Cloud of Unknowing, or different Christian mystics along the way, different Christian contemplative texts, and you're going, wow, look, these maps are the same as the Buddhist texts, or the same as the Hindu texts in terms of map? Or are you doing something more phenomenological and experiential? Like, I mean, are you actually going and getting together with contemplative Christians, contemplative Hindus, and seeing what their experiences are like?
Both, or ideally
Yeah, nice.
both.
Yeah, tell me about that.
And
I'm so interested in this.
yeah, so if I sort of start with the practitioner perspective, I just enjoy these handbooks a lot. You
Yeah.
know, just it's not theory; it's about experience. But that also connects to science. So you can read these handbooks as basically manuals of experiments that you can perform. You know,
Right.
and that's where it connects. So when I say research, at least a big part of it is actually trying these things out. You know, and I could talk a lot about developments within first person methods and things like that, but the difference is that, like, the typical, let's say, introspective work is that meditation requires time, at least in order to go deeper. So that's like a typical setup with them be, okay, so I'll take a week and go on a retreat, and then I'll have like a daily schedule, and then I have the meditation techniques and maybe the research question. And then I have a sort of setup, for instance, with the thing I did on the second landmark, Dhyāna or access concentration. I would then like build that state up, which takes for me 3 to 5 days, which is just meditation. Maybe take some notes when it comes to interesting issues. And then when the state opens up, I do interviews on the different stages of that. Like, when do I start to sense that it's approaching? Like, when is it coming? When is it growing? What does that feel like? And then there's like specific, for instance, microphenomenological methods that you'd use there. And then you go into the state, and it's hard to do research in the state. This is sort of an interesting issue as well when
Well,
you start
yeah,
to look at it.
you wouldn't be able to
It's
do it
messy
in
stuff.
something like a jhana, because you're talking about an exclusionary
Yeah, yeah,
attentional
yeah,
state,
yeah,
right? I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
you
Yeah,
shouldn't be able to do anything there other than just sort of be in the sort of depth of the experience. But yeah, I guess
yeah,
you would
yeah,
do it
yeah.
after
And
you
yeah,
after you
so
come out of the pocket.
yeah, so this is a specific new hindrance that will come up. Your interest, sort of as a researcher, just basically what is this state that messes up sort of the practice side. So but that is can be sort of just mitigated by staying with the practice, and you kind of as a meditator, you know how to deal with hindrances to a certain extent. So you just have to live with that for a few days, and then you get kind of used to it. But you need to be able to switch sort of into the discursive, analyzing mode, observing mode, and actually the total opposite. You know, where you're not interested in things and completely opening up and letting go and things like that. And
Are
that is a
you,
sort of
sorry, just a question there. Are you doing this only on your own? Or is
no.
this something that you're doing like with teachers or with groups of people also?
Um, both there as well, or all three. Mostly on my own. Mostly on my own. That's where meditation manuals have been like incredibly useful. But then as it grows, so this sort of goes into the second aspect is then, okay, so I've taken my own notes, you know, but how scientifically interesting or valid is that? Um, but well, first, like there's research that's important to do also on the manuals, like comparing those. That's sort of the religious studies side. So that's what I also sort of will do as a preparation. Compare, for instance, the analogies they use. Is there some similar sort of structural, conceptual things there that I can sort of rely on and
Right.
even question during the practice? And
Yeah.
then there's the own thing where you go into the state and do the, for instance, the microphenomenology on it, and then you go into sort of comparing notes with other people, and that's a recent development. It was in a way also shut down by the pandemic. So that's kind of been on hold for a couple of years. But what happened before that was also that it became a communal issue where we'd go on retreats together, for instance, with students, and they would write their bachelor's thesis on different topics and would have like common research questions and share notes. And that material is still lying around, but that's sort of where yeah, where things are at the moment. Yeah.
I
So,
love this. I love this. You know, we hear a lot, of course, lots of people are interested in these states. They're interested in
mhm,
refining these abilities, regardless of which discipline they're coming from, you know, if they're in a Christian sort of lineage or Hindu or Buddhist.
mhm,
And I know lots of researchers are interested in these topics as well. But this
mhm.
is the first time I've heard that a bunch of researchers get together and they go out and they practice these states specifically in order to analyze them and think about them phenomenologically as like from the perspective of, oh, I'm writing a master's or, oh, I'm writing a
Mhm.
doctoral thesis on this. So let's go on retreat and see what we can figure out from, you know, Teresa of Avila's interior castle map
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then write on it.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think this
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
such a cool approach.
Yeah, and it's taken quite a while to develop. At least, you know, it's at least 20 years of work in preparation for this, just establishing phenomenological methods, and then you know you need different skill sets. You need to sort of be interested in going into meditation, and then also sort of the research side of it, and then you need to
Yeah.
find time to do this, maybe even financing for research like this. But the whole ideal is sort of a re-establishing of a contemplative I don't know, like a monastery or even an observatory. You know, that would be the sort of the new thing that's coming up there. And it's also very fun to do this kind of research,
Yeah,
like on a
yeah. I could just imagine, you know, just from what you've said so far, I can just imagine like it would be so great to see a doctoral or a master's degree give funding
Mhm,
for retreat time.
mhm.
I know Thomas Metzingers was involved in some programs in Germany that did this, where getting into the doctoral program also meant they were giving you some money for retreat time, for time to go out and sit with different teachers. Really cool, different ways that we could meshing contemplative practice with contemplative research.
Yeah, and that's where you also need to sort of build research communities, also find the right people to do this. And again, it's very fun way of doing research. Although, as you probably know, I can imagine that both of you are also practice meditation, know firsthand what the sort of comes with the territory. It's
Yeah.
not always fun. It can be
No.
really, really, really challenging. And
Sure.
imagine like going through something that's deeply challenging and approaching it with a researcher's mind. You know, that's also like there are new skill sets that needs to be developed for this kind of research.
Yeah.
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 um, but
I
that's
just
part
want
of
to
what
pick.
makes it meaningful. Yeah.
I just want to pick into a point here about the different traditions and how much consensus there is between traditions, because you know, like with my secular hat on, there's lots of significant differences between Christianity and Buddhism, etc. So I'm interested in to what degree there's consensus on the landmarks when it comes to contemplative practice.
Yeah, I think towards the end of the maps, disagreement grows, um, and that's also where sort of it's hard to keep the secular hat on, you know, going into that. And in a way, I've just put these questions on hold. Like I'm open about whatever may come through practice, but there are also deep issues related to just conceptualizations of the divine, for instance, that I wish to go into, but at the moment I'm not there yet, and I need to, or I want to build this with the researcher's mind, like everything experientially supported at least, but with the interest in all kinds of experiences that come out of it, and I think there might be even different endpoints to these paths, you know. Uh, with regards to concentration meditation, I think it's not that hard to disagree that the mind tends to wander, you know, when you try to focus. And there is some experience where contemplative says there's something happened in practice where I could just let go and my mind stayed with the object. So you get sort of experiential descriptions that people can relate to and check for themselves. And at one point, this is very interesting. Where does that stop? And like there's this typical story that you might have heard about, like the theologians disagree, but if you get the contemplatives in a room and just share experiences, they tend to agree. And I think there's something to that. At the same time, I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure that we in the end can agree upon what God means, what divinity means, what the end of suffering means, what immortality means. But like I'm a trained philosopher, and that's what I want to go into at one point, but based then on contemplative experience rather than theory alone, you know. So that's kind of a setup for that. Yeah.
One interesting, just in relationship to this that I've heard recently that I love. You know, Lee Brasington is a jhana teacher in the United States, and for anybody who's listening today and doesn't know what jhana is, jhana are these sort of master level attention states, and they really are a sort of altered consciousness state where attention becomes so powerful that you have little momentary exclusion states where lots of stuff is cut out and you have a really sort of refined object for a duration of time. And you know, Lee is teaching in the Buddhist tradition, but really very much in the sort of North American pragmatic Buddhist way. So it's really in some ways cut away from the lineage. And he talks a lot about the neuroscience of jhana, you know, what's happening in the brain and what's happening with reward circuitry. But one of his students, Jay Mickelson, who is a very popular Jewish mystical contemplative teacher and practitioner, learns from Lee the technologies, but then reinterprets them in the Jewish context as examples of nearness to God, where it is, rather than just thinking of just pure joy, pure happiness, pure equanimity, these are the textures that the jhanas have as you progress them from, you know, into more and more refinement. He reinterprets this in the religious context of drawing closer and closer to source. And so even though they're having potentially the same machinery activated, the cultural embedding of that machinery is different. And I suspect the phenomenology might be separate, might have a different sort of, at least if the phenomenology of the state isn't different, it's the way that it's interpreted by the practitioner, I suspect, is different. Anyway, I think it's a very interesting example of this.
Yeah, and that's also where disagreement starts, you know, with these deeper states, and like what exactly is a jhana, you know? And
this is a big debate also.
and I think there might be more to it. Like it's very interesting to hear you sort of describe this reinterpretation, and it kind of relates to my phenomenological work there as well, because like I would go into the state then and go out of it and try to describe it, like using experiential terms. What did I experience there? Like forget about the books for now and just describe it, you know? And then there are the terms that are easily relatable to the traditions. For instance, something happens to thinking, something happens to concentration, becomes effortlessness. But then I started to go to terms like, for instance, this is just magical, you know?
Well, awe-inspiring.
Awe. And it feels cozy. It feels like protected. And then I go to words like secluded. And then I remember. So seclusion is a term that's also used for describing these kinds of things.
Yeah.
But that's like maybe like a deeper human experience that at least the Buddhist text didn't like describe that much, and other people would describe as closeness to God, you know? And so the further work there would be to just say like what terms can we agree on, you know? And then there are the challenges when it comes to describing or agreeing upon exactly what constitute the state. So there's like a defining story there from the Buddhist tradition where we see that they had similar problems. There is a monk that claims that he got into the fourth jhana, and then describes it, and it says something about hearing something. And then the other monks react, did he say you hear something? And the fourth jhana is supposed not to, like the external sounds are shut off. So are you lying about your attainments? Which would be a big problem because then you're excluded from the religious community of the Sangha. So they went to the Buddha and asked him, like, what should we do about this guy? Should he be excluded? Or did he have the fourth jhana? And then you can imagine what would you do in a situation like that? And in a way, I think it's a very good, maybe wise, pragmatic solution. He said that this monk had an imperfect realization of the fourth jhana. And that's where it also gets interesting. So, these states aren't that clear cut, and that's very clear when you go into them. Like there's a lot of wiggling room in a sense between these things. And then, of course, there's a question about, so is there something maybe to the physiological system of the Buddha that made him prone to exclude sounds? You can ask questions like that. So there might be individual differences that we haven't like caught at all, and we need to get into that.
Yeah, very interesting.
With the help then of modern science, neuroscience, which makes this kind of new. I think that's also an essential aspect, sort of that dialogue as well. Yeah.
The other interesting detail here is like the question of, are these... So there's like different specific things we can talk about, like jhana, and we can debate, well, was that attaining the fourth jhana or was it not? But, given that we're all human beings with the same wetware, the hardware and sort of principles of how our brains develop, it seems likely to me as a listener that they must almost by definition be talking about the same thing. And this is an interesting point because a lot of the ontological claims that Buddhism will make will be different to Christianity. But when you talk about the contemplative wing of this, you're almost committed to talking about the same thing just because the partitioners, i.e. human beings, are the same. When you read these different texts, are you looking through with that lens, this commitment that ultimately they have to be talking about the same end goal?
I can say that for myself. Yeah. That's I guess that's to a certain extent personal, like in the way that I've grown up without like a strong framework, religious framework, but with some kind of interest. And I met Christianity at an early age, Buddhism at an early age, and we're in a situation, I'd say historically even, where there's a lot of like interaction between human beings and then also traditions, and I mean, that's at least how I come to it. We're human beings, we can do things with our minds, and we can share notes, and we can try to understand what's happening to us. And of course, I think you need to pay respect to the traditions as well. Like these are people who devoted their lives to this, to maybe like a larger extent that anyone can do today. At least if you want to have a research like practice at the same time, So there's something also to be learned there, and also about the internal debates they had. There were interactions between traditions earlier, and they disagreed about something and they agreed about something. But I don't. Maybe that's just an intuition. Maybe we share an intuition there, is in the sense that like we're human beings, we can talk about our experiences, and we can agree upon things. Yeah. And I, as I said earlier, I don't know where sort of the framework, let's say, takes over. We go into interpretation that's not supported by experience, But yeah, I think that needs to happen as well, like that discussion. And meditation research isn't there yet, I'd say. But there are very interesting metaphysical questions coming, I think. Yeah.
Let's talk about your work looking at the relationship between community and practice.
Hmm.
It's something that we talk a lot about here. How would you characterize that relationship traditionally?
Um, yeah. So big life decisions. Leave your family. You know. Uh, I think that's kind of the foundation, that you had an already existing framework or community that you could take part of, and that was a big life decision, often supported by the cultural context as well. And I think
Mm.
that has changed. Um, uh, yeah, and I think practitioners today also notice that, at least if you want to go into the deeper end of the practice and you don't feel like you can commit to any specific tradition, maybe you're committed to truth or research and happiness, something like that. So where would you find a community that can support that? And there aren't that many. Maybe you'll find, like, in a sense, sort of outgrowths of old traditions that are opening up to supporting people. But I think that we need some kind of, let's say, cultural creativity when it comes to giving people opportunity to do things like this. Maybe even sort of in a universalistic way. And I think we haven't figured that out as a society, how we support people who want to do this.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
you're touching here on a paradox that I often think about, which is, on the one hand, the Buddhists will say, look, community is super important and it's very difficult to go and get all of the attainments, or at least the path is rockier without
Mhm.
community. But also, I have this image of the monk on the rock by himself
Right.
and
Yeah.
the vast number of hours you need to put in.
Hmm.
And it's just difficult for me to parse apart quite how crucial community is.
Hmm.
When you think about the types of adept states that you're talking about, do you see that as an exercise, at least for a non-researcher, that can be
Hmm.
done in isolation?
What do you mean? Can I say something more about that? Like,
Yeah, so like, do you imagine that it's possible or likely, comparatively, to do this type of work in a community or by oneself?
that's a very good question. I don't know. What I can say from experience is that some of it is possible, but you tend to get into this dynamic of, I need more time, and then I
Hmm.
can do something, and I need more time. And at one point, it's not possible to sustain sort of a regular life with like regular work, you know? So you get that at one point, and then, but I think, at least for me, it's been important to have a sense of community and maybe continuity, which comes through the meditation manuals. But I've been doing research, some research on communities, meditation communities as well, and there are experiences of loneliness, like feeling that you're isolated, uh, and especially when it comes to difficult experiences, like there can get a sense, it can arise a sense that you've done something wrong to your mind, you know, uh, and if you're not able to share that, what do you do about it, you know? And the communities had specific, I don't know, maybe, yeah, maybe even rules and at least practices for navigating this territory, and even basic things like recognition. You know, you're going to isolate yourself for 3 months. Like, way to go! This is a good thing. You know, um, and for me, work-wise, that wouldn't be possible. So there is like a limit here, and which is like, in a sense, it's a shame, because these later stages, later landmarks probably requires something like that. But again, I think there's some room also for creativity here. People, even in the tradition, stress that at one point it's important to do practices within a community, like relating to other people, relating to the world. That's where the deep stuff comes. So
And
maybe like a new set of practices also for that. Yeah.
and do you see that the neuroscience and our greater understanding of these topics might actually help the acceleration of those states?
Very good question. I hope so. I hope we can learn more about the mind. I'm not sure how that will go, but there, as you might be aware, there are technologies being developed that might support going into deeper states more quickly. Um, And yeah, it might be a requirement, but there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done before that kind of technology, I think, is finished and we know whether it's useful or not. But that's also a basic challenge for contemplative science. I think these states are hard to build up, and they tend to go away quite quickly.
Ju-
Uh,
Can I
yeah.
just ask? Can I just ask a quick
Mhm.
question there? Are you currently working with anybody in the cognitive or neurosciences on these things? Because you have this strong phenomenological
Yeah.
foundation, and like you said, you're coming from philosophy, so it
Mhm.
seems like it would be a good fit for you to
Yeah.
be working alongside sort of cognitive scientists potentially if there is
Yeah.
this
Yeah. Yeah.
possibility. Is this something
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
doing already?
Oh yeah, definitely. I'm working with Matthew Saquette, for instance, and we're setting up this study on basically meditation experts. So I'm going to do interviews on different experiences, which is just an extension of my work, and then we're going to
Yep.
get the neuroscience feedback on that to see sort of whether we can push that some further, in a sense, or at least get clear about what the problems are and how we can solve them. But yeah, so that's definitely something I'm interested in also doing, and I think also should be expanded. But then, okay, so we have this equipment is expensive. It's located at specific places, and then you have this challenge of
Yeah,
like we
all
need
of the
people to do
problems of
this.
science, right?
Yeah,
All of the problems of science. Where's the lab? How do
yeah,
we
yeah,
get to
yeah,
the lab? How do we get the
yeah,
equipment on site?
yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
You just said there for a second, though, you did say there were certain problems and you were hoping to find solutions. What were those problems that you're
Well, for
thinking of? Do you have
instance,
any?
yeah. For instance, can we agree what an altered state is?
Yeah, nice.
Specifically the jhanas.
Yeah, nice.
What do we agree upon and what do we disagree upon, and how can we
Yep.
sort of maybe involve neuroscience there? Can we do certain experiments? Can we learn something more about human physiology that would be
Yep.
informative here? And then compare notes, involve contemplatives.
Yep.
So there is this sort of idea of a contemplative observatory. I think that needs to be set up, and um, humans have done that and in other fields like the Human Genome Project, like big international projects, pushing things forward. And I think there are things like this happening, but it's going to be a
Yep.
slow process as well. Yeah.
It's also uniquely challenging because with the Human Genome Project, at least we had a shared definition of what a genome
Yep.
was, and it
Yep.
was more a mechanical case of can we put this together.
Yep.
Whereas if I have an experience on the mat and I go and ask 10 people within 10 slightly different traditions, I might
Mhm.
get 10 slightly different interpretations of whether it's good
Yeah.
or bad.
And Jamie,
Yeah.
you know what? It's more difficult than even that because within the Buddhist tradition, there is literally a jhana war happening right now, where it's a whole gradated scale from very, very light states to incredibly challenging states that take thousands of hours and take long-term retreat in order to achieve. So even within that tradition, there's this huge variation. And not only that, but within a tradition, even if we were to take a subcamp, I'm sorry, I'm a bit passionate about this because I'm also studying jhana right now. So it's interesting we get a chance to talk about this. Even within the sub tradition where they agree on it, so they say, no, jhana is like this, that doesn't count, and the deeper one doesn't count. This is what jhana is all about. Then you have to get people who say they can get into it. And then the question is whether or not they can actually get into it, or are they getting into something that's not actually it? I mean, you can make the mind have all sorts of states just by having a strong intention to create a state. And then is that actually the state that's evolved from the progression of the practice? Or is it a fabrication? So even if you think about the compounded complexity here, so now you get a group of people who say they can do it even within a subpart of the tradition, and who knows if they can do it or not. It's a complex case. And then what is it that they're doing, and can they agree on it? Can they describe it? We just interviewed some people, and it was very interesting. We didn't at all get the same sort of reports, even though they're in the same tradition, practicing the same sorts of skills.
Yeah. That's the complexity of research, and I think it's even worse. Can we even agree,
Worse
can
than
we even,
this.
can we even agree upon what meditation is? you know.
Yeah.
The different techniques. I think, like going back to the Human Genome Project, they at least had classified the different molecules involved here, or atoms
Yeah.
even involved here, you know.
Yeah.
And this is the most recent work I did. I tried to create sort of a classification system for different meditation techniques, and even say something about what unifies it. And this is just like essential groundwork for doing phenomenological work as
Yeah.
well. Like if we're going to compare notes, we also need to compare what we do. Like agree upon, like, are we sharing techniques here? To what extent, you know? Yeah, in a way, there's a lot of stuff on all fronts that needs to happen at the same time in a way, you know?
Yeah, when you say mindfulness, that's not at all
Yeah,
clear
yeah,
what you're
yeah.
saying.
There you go. There you go.
Like if you tell a practitioner in a lab, hey, now practice mindfulness for 10 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
is that body scanning, mindfulness of the breath? Do you mean open monitoring? Do you mean something very exclusive? Actually, that's not at all clear just from saying practice mindfulness, which is one of the big hurdles in the science of meditation today, isn't it?
Yeah. So, and then like use all the terms you just use, and then maybe describe your practice, and we can see whether we're doing the same thing, you know?
Yeah.
And then go from there.
Um, yeah, and you talk separately about difficult meditation experiences and the way they're
Mm-hmm.
interpreted. And while we're talking about
Mm-hmm.
the jhanas and the high dopamine quote unquote states, I read that the research basically says something like this: the more adept you are, i.e., if you're 15 years in, the same kind of feedback in terms of breathing or whatever is going on can be interpreted as good, pleasureful, etc. But at the start, it's not. What's going on there? Because that's an interesting distinction.
Wow. There's something that happens, I think, in contemplation that, in a way, just breaks apart the frameworks that we usually use to understand experience. Uh, you have, for instance, non-dual perspectives, non-dual concepts, even maybe, where there's one of my favorite sayings is from, I think it's called Milarepa's song. It's describing something he goes through that's maybe difficult, maybe blissful, maybe both. And it kind of sums it up saying that it feels so good that feeling bad feels good. So there's something that happens to the distinction, you know, and a typical experience, I'd say, on the deeper end of practice, even for beginners, is that you can have challenging experiences. It can get difficult. And if you go through that over and over and somehow manage to navigate it, you kind of start to connect that to growth, you know? So there's something deep happening here. It's still very unpleasant, very challenging, but some part of your mind may know that, okay, something interesting is coming here. So that's kind of, you could regard that as a landmark, you know? You start to relate differently to what you're going through. And then maybe on the even deeper end, these distinctions aren't that valid for you anymore, you know, or you equally accept both, or equally like if, more than accept, you cherish both, you welcome both, and sort of take that into the same experience. Yeah.
I
Um,
the the interesting detail in there that jumps out at me straight away is the fact that you're connecting it with growth, and therefore maybe that feels good. I mean, people
mm-hmm.
in the gym who go to the gym for 6 months rather than one day
Yeah.
probably report the same.
Yeah, yeah. And this is also a very interesting topic. I often use the metaphor of going to the gym, uh, because it's often unpleasant, and the unpleasantness is somehow connected to it being good, you know. But it can also be a signal that something is not okay, that damage is happening. And this is also like a very important topic, I think. Where do you draw the distinctions here? When does something become harmful?
Yeah.
And when is it related to growth? And this is also one of the things I've been working on. I did a paper on breathing changes
Mm,
and panic attacks. This is also like based on my own meditation experiences, the notes I took. I can just like very quickly like
please.
outline
Yeah.
that whole paper.
Yeah.
Uh, and this is maybe 20 years ago now or more. When I initially started meditating regularly, I noticed breathing changes. My breath became irregular, and quite quickly that became connected to fear on a deep level. And then after some years, the breath stopped and the fear increased. And after maybe around 15 years, it grew into panic attacks and a sense like of deep fear also like coming up whenever I sat down. And that whole thing, it's a long story, was resolved on a Vipassana retreat. Basically, like focused on the experience of fear coming and breath stopping. And the process there is also quite interesting because I think it's deeply connected to developing equanimity. Like being on a retreat can be quite harsh. So you need to develop equanimity to be there. And with strong equanimity, you can approach things that in your daily life you couldn't, you know? So that whole like increased equanimity made it possible for me to approach that experience, let the panic come and resolve itself and completely leave.
And it didn't come
So
back after this. Like after you were able to
no,
just abide equanimously with the panic coming from sitting quietly, it healed itself.
even more than that, whenever breath stops now, it's a very pleasant, even blissful experience.
I
Yeah.
see.
So, and this is a transformation that took, I think, around 18 years, you know? And if you would single out 5, 10 early years, it was this is just unpleasant. Nothing is happening here, you know? And this is about data collection in a way on a level that we're not doing at all. You know, I think it's about following the whole of human lives. And yeah, again, I think that's where we need to go. And I think we can also find this in the traditions like the dark night of the soul lasting for 40 years or whatever, you know. Yeah, and for contemplative science, I think that's really important to just remind oneself that these processes can be really, really long and
Yeah, really can.
excruciating. Yeah,
What
yeah.
kept you going doing it for 15 years? Like,
Ah,
what
good
what
question.
was why was it interesting?
That's a good
I guess,
question. Do
yeah,
you
I
know?
guess that. No, I definitely had benefits as well. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So
Mm.
that also grew. But at one point, whenever it becomes very unpleasant to sit down and close your eyes and focus on your breath, that kind of makes it impossible to meditate. Like you slowly get out of that whole mindset when it doesn't do anything for you. So I found inspiration from different traditions, just knowing that people have gone through these things, and even that the challenge here is important. You know, this is finally something important is happening. You know, there's a big possible opening here. But when you're in that space, you don't really know, and that's where things like faith becomes important. Determination, like traditional, maybe even religious concepts, start to make complete sense to you.
Yeah.
Like I need to trust that there's something important happening here, and I need to open up to that. You know, and that's even a contemplative skill that develops then through these challenges that is useful in other contexts as well. You know.
Here again is
Um,
one of the, just branching back a little, where a community and a wise instructor can be super
yeah,
valuable, right? So that you know, because of course there are ways that you can misuse your attention that can exacerbate problems, and there's ways that you can use attention that are going to resolve problems,
yeah,
and that's not
yeah,
always obvious from inside the animal, because the animal is going, "This is no bueno, this
yeah,
is not a good place to be." And to have either a wise instructor or a good older friend on this path be able to say, no, 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 that's totally fine. That happens to everybody. Or somebody to say, let me check in with your practice. Oh, it sounds like maybe you're practicing a little bit inappropriately.
yeah.
Try this instead.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I did check with teachers, and they gave me different advice,
Yeah.
which is
Here
interesting
again,
itself.
phenomenology, right? I mean, this is a
Yeah,
challenging
yeah, yeah.
thing. Sure.
Yeah, so try both. That's sort
Yeah.
of where I go back to often. Try both and see how it works. Like
So
this is
you're a little bit like a
tangent benefit.
scientist over your own mind then, right? In a way, I mean, you're
Yeah,
testing hypotheses. Does this work or not? And being
yeah,
willing to adjust your hypothesis along the way.
yeah, 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 yeah. So you need to be involved in these processes then as a whole human being. You know, you rely on
Yeah.
your complete skill sets.
Yeah.
But of course, also like friends,
Yeah.
community,
Yeah.
like in times like that, it's incredibly valuable. Yeah.
Um,
Um,
I want to ask then, it's sort of a slight pivot. You've written that participants in these studies with higher levels of repetitive negative thinking, and those who only engaged in deconstructive types of meditation,
mhm,
so
mhm.
that's Vipassana insight, um, were more likely to experience unpleasant meditation-related experiences. Can you
Yeah.
explain maybe why that is, and also just explain beforehand what a deconstructive type of meditation is?
Right. This is from the Schlosser study, right?
Mm.
Uh, and that's only, I would say, like, or at least initially, that's an empirical finding. We don't try to explain why that is, but like a deconstructive technique would be looking at sensations, for instance, experiences, and it's also a question whether or not you're interpreting it, but analyzing it at least. Uh, is it pleasant, unpleasant? Can you find a self there? In your feeling, in your body, uh, and basically tease it apart and try to discover the building blocks of human experience. So then removing the usual sort of constructions that we overlay on experiences, you try to pull those back. And that can be unsettling because your usual sort of your usual framework of reference dissolves. Things don't mean the same thing to you as they used to, and that can be unsettling. So this whole world that I'm usually walking around in can be experienced completely different, you know. And so, what is reality? Where is the self? My usual identity, I can't find it anymore. And this is also, related to contemplative processes. Maybe this is a sort of a part of uncovering a deeper truth, which can be then very unpleasant and unsettling. You're in a way then just reconstructing yourself or deconstructing yourself for a potential reconstruction, maybe, or even just uncovering that there is something else there, or even nothing. Yeah.
So the idea then is that work is fairly difficult psychologically and
Well,
comes with maybe ultimate benefits at the end. But if you're prone to a certain kind of negative thinking, those systems might sort of jump onto the feedback you're experiencing.
yeah, that might be separate. Like the tendency to have negative thought, that's also related to having negative experiences, or experiencing meditation as very unpleasant. I think that's the precise way to put it. And I mean, that seems pretty obvious to me that.
Yeah, that's intuitive.
Uh, yeah, I think that's pretty intuitive, and maybe even then sitting down to meditate would make that tendency more clear to you. You
Yeah.
know?
You can
Yeah.
Mm.
imagine that if the system is already vigilant
Hmm.
for there being problems,
Yeah. Yeah.
then when you have a destabilization come because of a contemplative practice,
Yep.
then the vigilant system, if it's not been rooted up, if it's not been healed yet, it's going to grab right onto, wow, something has just happened, and
Yep.
I'm going to interpret it in a sort of bad way, and
Yep.
that's not going to help.
Yep.
That's not going to help the system
Yeah.
feel
Yeah.
good. I bet. I mean, that will be just more evidence that things are going wrong.
Yeah. And what do you do there? Should you encourage somebody to sit through that,
Yeah.
or is there some point where it's not helpful anymore? And I think that's
God.
just like a basic sign for or a basic question for contemplative science.
Yeah.
Try to figuring that out. Try to figure that out.
I don't know. Just talking now, it really feels to me like if that tends to be your quality, you could really benefit from having therapy or practicing these sort of heartful trainings first, like
Hmm.
self-compassion,
Hmm.
forgiveness,
Hmm.
gratitude, so that you have a foundation of a happy, healthy mind before
Yeah.
you start knocking the walls out of your self-structure.
Yeah. And that was also something I found that constructive techniques also were like less connected to unpleasant experiences, but not that much. But I think that's also that's a phenomenological question for a retreat setting. What would be helpful to a person with that kind of personality structure? What
Yeah.
kind of strategies would be helpful, and maybe even why? But yeah.
Um, Before we finish up, I want to talk about the practical elements. You're obviously a long-time meditator and have been also sort of doing the research from the inside out, if you like.
Hmm.
Um, what messages would you have liked to have received when you started that would have made your journey easier?
Stick with it. Stick with it.
Stick with it.
Yeah. And like, easy stuff like don't give up, and maybe get informed. Get informed more early. Get in touch with other people. Find a community. Uh, yeah, but I think also like there is some possibility of just like trusting that there's some wisdom in this kinds of processes. You know, if you're left alone trying to figure this out, it might take much longer to go through it. But imagine then on a deeper end of practice where you really have to go into the big loneliness, you know, maybe you already have the skill set. Maybe then you don't need to sort of separate from your community. You already sort of know that. So like things like that then maybe. So okay, try to do this, stick with the practice, maybe find a supportive community, but also just trust that this is unfolding the way it should be. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, Terje, thank you so much for coming on. Where can everybody at home find you and find what you're up to?
Yeah, so just my name, terjesparby.com. You'll find my publications there. And then you can have a look at unitedmindarts.com as well. In a few months, there will be a meditation book there coming out. So you can have a look. But maybe it's just summarizing the things I've been talking about here. Yeah.
Brilliant, mate. Well, listen, thank you so much for coming on. Mark, thank you as always.
Thank you both as well.
This has been the Contemplative Science Podcast. I hope you have a great rest of day wherever you are in the world. And as always, we'll see you next week.